Hi, I'm Nick Felaris, and I make art and music as Codex. This is Avert Chroma. Avert Chroma is an audiovisual installation and an accompanying album which took me 3 years to produce. It involves paintings on the floor, paintings on the ceiling, paintings on the walls. It's meant to emulate a complete world of black and white. So, we enter with the emulation that you're in a club. So these are real flyers that I made for Toledo venues like the Bridge and Beautiful Rat Records. And then they come into these prints and these paintings on the floor. And then you're in the middle of everything, kind of like a nucleus in a cell. And in the middle is a live album that I did to benefit Culture Clash Records. It's my reflection of me loving the creativity in an underground scene. These are also a compilation of illustrations that I've done. I make collages using an actual Xerox, and I take a razor blade to images that I find. And in my little scatterbrained way of picking apart each piece of media that I find, I make it into some other thing. These involve characters, usually animals or robots or things that aren't quite human, and they're kind of characters in a world. These are for bands, these are for people outside of the gallery sphere. And this is the entire point, is to bring this underground crazy character culture into a museum sphere. So, this is the 2024 record by Power Failure Master System, which came out on Then and Now Records. I designed the logo and the label for this Essex power violence band. They're really great. This was my first release on vinyl, which as a fan since 13 meant a lot to me. So the front is a 1900s picture of a chandelier, and on the back it's a class pyramid, which is kind of the electricity that I felt from getting physicals as a kid. There's a print version of this in this room too. So on the A side is a portrait of a king dissected several times. There's crowns on his face. And on the B side, there's the relic of the king melted with the candles of the front cover illustration. I grew up in Toledo, so working class culture was never not in my life as a kid. Art, especially, was kind of seen as just a hobby, and of no real merit. So I was never not at conflict with power in my life. I almost think that human relationships are just kind of weird. I never kind of understood like the relationships that people have with in just everyday life, you know. A theme in a lot of my art is like anthropomorphism. Humans that are not quite human, or they're cats or they're robots, or when they are human and they're collaged, like they're dissected several times. I find that's a more humanizing way than just taking a picture of someone, because it's just this fictional universe that you exist in that goes beyond power, if that makes sense. If there is like the theme of power, that's kind of how I relate to it. And I also think that's a very positive thing more than it's a negative thing too, because that's what makes us accept others. If we focus solely on the accomplishments of one individual, how can that be good for anybody else? You should be using your abilities kind of like Spider-Man, or something like, with great power comes great responsibility. So you have to give back to the people. And that's also kind of the reason why I wanted this culture in this show in general. It's because we need to remind people that this exists too. And that you can be silly and you can be non-human and all these different things. That's a very important thing in my life. Or at least that's the universe that I want to happen. So I entered graffiti when I was about 12 or 13. I took a hiatus, focused on college, and then became a freelance graphic designer. But the spirit of graffiti never left. I was really looking into the idea of throw-ups, which are quite literally you throw it up on a wall, and you don't pay attention to it, and it's an abstract version of a letter. And there's these all kind of smeary, messy things. So it's the language of graffiti, but again, brought into an art institution. There's a dime a dozen artists who do that, but I want to put it in people's faces, almost. And I think that's what graffiti does, too. I'm not a political person, but I am very, very adamant about like the politics behind graffiti, the emotions behind it, and like the cluttered areas that they come out of, and that kind of appeals to like the scatterbrainness of my life. And again, it's deducing colors down to black and white, so purely working on values, seeing when whites smear into black, smear into white again, smear into black, that was always really interesting. My first teenage job, I was a busker, so I would be down at the farmer's market singing and playing a guitar. But my first actual salaried job was with a program in Toledo called Young Artists at Work, and they employ adolescent kids to paint murals. So me coming from a tiny little suburb, just 20 minutes south of Toledo, and being with those kids and like making something impactful on walls with them, that was a huge turnaround for me. And again, if you go to a university and solely get like a degree, you're not seeing that world that happens. Cities are a really big influence on my life too. My first album, Alley Cat Face, I self-produced it in the span of 3 years when I was 18 in 2020. And it's a fictional world where like these cat people kind of live in cities. Cats, for one, I just vibe with. Like, I'm a very catty person. I'm very moody. And getting into that territory, instead of taking, doing a still life of a bowl of fruit or a picture of a person, it's a lot more revealing to find some things about something that's not quite human to kind of make into your own. I also think of it as science fiction. I'm a very big science fiction fan. And science fiction is interesting to me in the sense that it's taking elements of real life and abstracting them. Because art in general is you can choose to do realism, which I think is kind of redundant, or you can choose to use fiction as a device to your ability, which can be very, very fun. Anthropomorphism kind of appeals to me in that same way, too. You can transform and like be some other big thing, but that's, just me waxing poetic or something.
First things first, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where you grew up, where you're from, and what got you into art.
Yeah, so
Like what?
I'm from Toledo, Ohio. I grew up in the suburb of Perrysburg, and I got into art at a really young age. I was drawing comics since first grade, kindergarten. I spent a good deal of time being an actor and being in a lot of plays. And I knew that there was just something kind of different about me. I didn't like sports. I kind of just wanted to like do my own thing. And I got into punk as an adolescent like everybody else. I completely absorbed it in what it stood for. And ever since that point, I got into busking, so I was a street performer for a long time. I was working as a muralist for my first job, and I was my own fanzine publisher. I made comics just nonstop. I made my own video essays. I started editing videos since the time I was like 13. I grew up with sort of Adult Swim culture, like 2010s. Everybody who's grown up in the 2010s knows that it was dubstep compilations, EDM compilations. I feel like a lot of people in Ohio, especially like Perrysburg or Toledo, they're very accustomed to living how they normally live their lives, and that's country music, or what we know as country music, or it's rock, or it's the Stones, or something.
Sure, it's like a 94.5.
94.5, 101.5, The River.
Area, yeah.
Yeah, but again, EDM was also a really big influence in my career as sort of electronic musician too. I did graffiti when I was 12 or 13. I took a break from it to focus on university studies. I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio for my undergrad. I kind of completely hated it. No, because you have like your art school friends and they're great, and I did campus radio. I met really cool people there, but everybody else was just such a business bro. It just made me feel so weird, and I didn't feel accepted. And so it was when I decided to pursue art full time and produce my few first albums. That's where I took art as like a full-time job.
You mentioned getting into punk music, and I feel like anyone who's taken even one look at your art can tell the punk subculture has clearly been a big influence of yours. So tell me a bit more about that. What got you into punk? If you have any memories of like bands or songs or moments that maybe got you interested in that subculture, and how did that affect your life getting into that scene?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was a longtime listener of WXUT, which is Toledo's college-run radio. So college radio was a really big influence in my life. And I went to Culture Clash. I also went to Finders Records and Allied Exchange.
I used to go there all the time.
Allied Exchange particularly is a good pinpoint because they have people who trade in records for cash, so it can literally come from anywhere. I was listening to a lot of 12-inch singles of DJ mixes I got, and I could take that home to my turntable, and that was my first experience with the turntable. And the college radio link to punk I listened to a lot of industrial, so Big Black was a really big influence, and Steve Albini's career was a really big influence on me. And Big Black, for their music, I liked them because they used a drum machine, which I'd never heard before. It's like a technological view of punk that's weird and cold, and other bands like Nine Inch Nails kind of also delve into that too. And that kind of ignited my love for machines and how Big Black used machines in like a punky way. That was my first exposure to that kind of music.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the things that draws you to punk music is the sort of colder, harsher, industrial, almost mechanical side of some of these bands like Big Black. It sounds like you have sort of this fascination with the mechanical, and it seems like that comes through in your art too. Like some of your collages I notice have a lot of machinery in them. Your newest album, Avert Chroma, by my understanding, samples you've collected of machines.
Yes. Yeah, so Avert Chroma was produced over a course of 3 years. It was between 2023 and 2025, or 2022 and 2025. It involved me taking samples of playing metal instruments like pots, pans, cut pieces of sheet metal, contact microphones that were put onto pieces of metal, and filtering them through drum machines. Like I have an 808 drum machine and an SP404 sampler, and reworking them into beats that try to paint a fictional universe of a mechanical world. I thought of machines as like almost like frigid or like nervous, but also like really warm once you activate your mind and try to understand how a machine works. And especially as a digital designer too, because I work with digital programs, I like isolating myself and entering like digital worlds. And we talked about anthropomorphism too, and I think that machines are also kind of anthropomorphic in their own way. So that's kind of what machines mean to me.
So when you were showing me your art that you have on the wall before, you were saying that you sort of imagine these as occupying sort of a shared world, right? And you were saying something similar about Avert Chroma, where you have this sort of idea that these machines are in their own sort of world. So that idea of putting together a world that multiple pieces or works of your art coexist in, is that something that you've kind of always done?
I aspire to it in a big way. It's out of a very big place of positivity. I really like the happiness of giving up real life and going into it like a fictional world or something. Avert Chroma is also a concept album, so each title on each song is a key to the object that I used, and it drives the narrative of starting into a machine world, and then I sampled like field recordings of me going to Beautiful Rat Records and like moshing and hearing trap beats as they played in a club for the outro and stuff like that. It's about like finding people in the real world and like connecting, like what we're doing right now, like just talking one-on-one and kind of talking about weird things in a humanistic way. Another theme that I do a lot is monsters versus animals too, because monsters and animals are two different things. I think that monsters are like a less innocent side of humans than animals. Animals, like, they're cuddly, cute, we all love them. Monsters, whether it be like in the power failure, like the cut up of the face, it's like kind of a bastardized version of looking at like this weird person. I really like the fun in fiction too, and being fun and open about yourself, even like in a machine world.
So you mentioned humor. Do you see some of your pieces as humorous, or is that kind of just something that's in the background a little bit in your art?
Yeah, I do, and I do that in the videos too. And the Beautiful Rat Records illustration that I did with the rhinoceros on the drum kit and like the two chameleons in the audience holding hands, that was all completely intentional because that was a venue that I loved, and being in a fictional world where like you can do that like gave me a lot of joy, and that's another way that like kind of relating to other people can work with that sort of thing.
Do you have any like examples that maybe stick out to you?
I really like the illustration that I did for the Michigan noise band Promaton. Promaton has Drew Binkley, who is kind of the main director of the Bridge on drums. Drew is a very talented drummer, and I did the illustration of the two-headed cyber dragon with like saw blades and Gatling guns, because for one, that was what the band wanted, and for two, that was like a way to kind of like make some like new completely crazy thing and like rattle other people's brains. I get joy out of whether, talking about doing interviews and making illustrations for other people. I like the expression of happiness that like is on other people's faces. So comedy also kind of applies to that too, whether it is like a silly subject matter like the Promaton Gatling gun dragon or something, or whether it's like making something nice for somebody. It gives me joy, so ultimately it gives other people joy. That's what I mean by humor. Yeah.
Yeah, that piece, I do find it to be a little amusing just because it is so like it's over the top.
Yeah,
you know what I
that's
mean?
right.
It's sort of it's packed with detail. And that was another question I had for you. Is I notice your pieces quite often are very like they're very detail dense. What is it about that sort of high frequency detail that interests you, that draws you in?
I think I'm just that kind of person. I'm a maximalist. I want to kind of give as much as I have to other people, whether that is like in an illustration or like we were talking about, like providing graphics for other people. I find that anything less than that is okay. I always try to push myself into what could be better about this thing, or what could be weirder or more esoteric. I put like in a statement that like a codex is a book of information that's like from the medieval times that nobody knows about, whether that's like alchemy or medicine or science. And knowledge is kind of like complexity, in that it's like kind of like reserved, or like you shy away from it in worst cases. In best cases, your mind activates and it kind of expands on that. And also just because I love drawing. Like I love the motion, I love the physicality of doing some, whether it is a painting or a digital collage or an animation or something. I'm also like a workaholic. Like the lever is always kind of on for me. I just can't put down the pen sometimes.
Sure, yeah, and I do want to ask you about that sort of that artistic workaholism that you have, because that's something that I think I can relate to, and a lot of people who are interested in the arts probably can also relate to that. But first I wanted to ask just about the name Codex. So when I heard Codex, I was imagining like, I'm a video guy, so my mind kind of immediately went to like a codec, like a way of encoding video or audio.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're thinking of it more as like a codex, as in like this sort of big tome full of maybe ancient, somewhat obscure knowledge.
Yes.
So do you see your collection of works as something similar to that, like this huge sort of esoteric collection of detail that people can look at and try to unravel, or is that am I totally,
No, you're totally
off
right.
track with that? Okay, well tell me about that then.
Yeah, you're totally right. And also, being a plunderphonic musician, plunderphonics is a genre that works in, it's an electronic genre that works in samples and taking samples and then recontextualizing them in some way. So also the idea that anybody can take anything from this and kind of collage it in their own way. I really like that. It's kind of charming. So it's also like a book, it's a thing that you can open up and explore for yourself and like make that your own little world. It's like making minutia out of very, very small things. I really dig plunderphonics and the remixing element, just being a DJ too. And I also like IDM, intelligent dance music. The term plunderphonics comes from an essay written by the writer John Oswald. John Oswald is a famous sound composer, and that's literally what the term derives from, like a pirate plundering something. The denotation of plunder, I think that can be a bad thing, like, oh, you're stealing. And I think that like me and you can both agree that we are so far behind the culture of stealing in terms of sampling, whether it's like licensing sound files to sample, whether that's having to pay someone to sample. Ideally, in an ideal world, I think that because of not just the internet, but literally anything is yours for the keeping, and that's something that you can use in your own art.
I mean, like, have you ever run into legal problems with that, or had to like skirt around using certain sounds because of worrying about running afoul of copyright laws or something?
Thankfully, no. And that's nothing against the idea that the artist should completely give up everything that they make. They deserve the right to vend and sell and get the profits from whatever they make. That is far and away different from the idea of stealing. If it's kind of in the wild terrain of the internet, it's kind of yours for the taking. I remember when I was making my first album, I was really influenced by 106 Point Never, and 106 Point Never is the alias of Daniel Lopatin, who made the first Vaporwave album, which is called Echo Jams, and his 2011 album Replica was a really big influence on me. And for Replica, it's an ambient album that only samples commercials. It's really good, and it kind of triggered this kind of concoction of what samples can be as a texture, or like a song can be a texture in something. And one more thing that I will add about samples is that something weird that I kind of came to realize when making this album, Avert Chroma, was that every sound, whether it's like a Beatles song or a Rolling Stones song that we hear from the 60s or something, like the analog tape has a texture to it. We hear a dance song, like we hear an Autechre song, and Autechre are a really good IDM duo who I really like too. we hear them and we think of like skyscrapers or something. That's apparent in any kind of sample source, whether that be visual too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, which is that the physical medium that something is stored on or originally recorded on can have its own texture that affects the way that you interpret the material. And I've actually run into the same thing with video. So for example, I've got a couple of VHS camcorders, and that's an analog videotape format. So it inherently has some like jitter and fuzziness to it that gives it a certain charm that is really hard to replicate in any other way. Even using one of those like VHS filters or whatever that are kind of in vogue now, like they don't look anywhere near the same, because at the end of the day, without that specific kind of analog tape or whatever format you're using, you're not going to get the characteristics of that format. So is that something that you consciously think about when you're picking sounds? Like, this is from this sort of format and it gives me this sort of particular feeling when I use it, or?
That was kind of a creative liberty too when doing the Noisy Sunday live album, because Drew ran around with a phone camera recording myself performing the samples live, and then I processed them using really crappy chroma keying, and it looks like crap, and it's like really pixely, but that was like a creative like freedom.
For those in the audience who might not be familiar, chroma keying is...
Chroma keying, it's basically green screening. It's when you have a solid background and you remove that background and you put it over another video. So that's also what green screening is.
Production techniques that you used on the video that's playing behind us? Okay. Yeah. I realize it's not in frame, but... Yeah. And Blender. Okay, and tell me a bit more about that stuff you did in Blender.
Going back to Death Grips, my favorite Death Grips album is Government Plates. I think what they did for the whole album, they made a visualizer that was nothing but free Blender models. And I thought, what a great idea to teach yourself how to do something. And I did the same thing with the Avert Chroma music videos. I took a lot of influence from that. And teaching myself just 3D technology is thinking of like things that go beyond 2D. But other than that, like even when you use it wrong, it can still look interesting, is what I came to believe.
All right. And taking it back to 2D for a second, this is something that I wanted to kind of circle back to. What are your techniques for drawing? Like what mediums do you use? Do you use markers? Do you use ink pens? Do you use calligraphy? Like, just kind of walk me through your process of making a drawing.
I use a lot of ink, spray paint, anything, and whatever it is, I run it through a Xerox too, and like that can give it like a crispness that I really like too. No medium is really off the table, and also teaching myself how to use a Wacom for digital drawing as an animation tool and also as a poster illustration tool. That was really like a kind of a thing that set me off in my head too. I think that's really great because you can edit and you can revise. I do a technique which I like to call blue lining, and blue lining is kind of a comic technique where if you have a thing that you want to draw, you start with a blue line underneath, and then you go over top that with layers, whether they be ink or whether they be like a digital drawing thing. It's been around for a while, but I do a lot of like back and forth.
Yeah, blue lining. I think that's a technique that I've heard of used in comic illustration. Yeah. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but once you Xerox something or once you scan something, the blue lines don't show up. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And also talking about influences, I'm a really big fan of comics and manga. I really like Beastars by Paru Itagaki, and also Black Sad by Juan Diaz-Canales and Juanjo Guarnido. And those are also really cool because they're comics that like anthropomorphize people and like look at people in weird ways.
Sure, and speaking of anthropomorphism in comics, I noticed the piece directly behind you, and we can always splice in a shot over this, but yeah. That piece with the very long title that I've got no hope of remembering. Just looking at the way the values are arranged, the sort of technique you use to draw it, and the anthropomorphic character, I can definitely see all of those influences coming through on that one.
It's a self-portrait.
It's a self-portrait, okay. Well, yeah. Tell me more about that then.
And the title is just kind of my frustrated way of coming to terms with who I am, and putting myself as a cat person, kind of also, like, we talked about, like, the moodiness of cats, and I identify with them a lot. And I also grew up straight edge, which, you know, man to man.
Yeah, I can relate, yeah.
Yeah. I think that, like, you come to terms with the way that a lot of things in the world are treated and how they can be. And it's not at all, nothing against people who are in drinking or drugs or alcohol. But, you know, coming to terms with that as a Midwestern kid, I think we both kind of agree that, like, it's kind of exciting, and it's a new way of looking at life that's more positive and not just it's kind of a cycle.
And it's certainly Okay, sorry. I'm totally distracted by that piece of paper that someone slid under the door. I I need to go see what that is.
Yeah, we gotta go see. This isn't live. Gallery is closed. Locked y'all in. So when you leave, doors will lock behind you. Clayton knows you're doing an interview, so take as long as what you want. That's just the gallery person. She's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right,
we're
cool.
totally cool.
All right. Well, I do have some bad news, which is that this thing is just about out of battery.
It's okay.
It's
Yeah, I
on,
figured
it's on
we were at the
reserve.
wrapping up point.
So